And it's hard to, I think I was a little in denial. It's hard to accept or like really see yourself being someone with that much influence or that much impact just because I've been myself my whole life.
Story I was fascinated by it before we talked to her. I'm a bigger fan after having spoken to her. Huge fan. Can't say enough good things about what she's doing for the sport and what a gift she is to us. It was a lesson in self-awareness. I'm sitting here at 43 years old, having been in this tennis game for a long time, and I'm going, there's no way I could ever be that pragmatic, that self-aware.
He sat across from her for 30 minutes, and the haters, the ones who spent months calling Eala's rise a fluke, calling her crowds a novelty, calling her story a nice temporary detour before the rankings corrected themselves, logged on this week to find a former world #1 publicly declaring himself a huge fan after 30 minutes of conversation. 30 minutes. And when it was over, when the microphones were off and the recording had stopped, and Andy Roddick was sitting there with his co-host John Wertheim, just processing what had just happened.
I could ever be that pragmatic, that self-aware, especially in the eye of the popularity storm.
He said it was a lesson in self-awareness. Not a great interview, not an impressive young player. A lesson in self-awareness. From a 20-year-old girl to a 43-year-old man who reached the pinnacle of the sport, who competed at Wimbledon finals, who built a media career on his ability to read athletes and extract their truth on microphone. Andy Roddick sat down with Alex Eala and walked away feeling like he had been taught something. And then he said the 4 words that sent the entire tennis world sideways.
I'm a bigger fan after having spoken to her.
Huge fan. Andy Roddick. Huge fan of a player ranked 29th in the world who hasn't won a Grand Slam, who is 20 years old, who the WTA establishment has been scrambling to accommodate all season while simultaneously failing to fully understand what is standing right in front of them. You cannot buy that. You cannot manufacture it. You cannot market test your way to Andy Roddick calling you a lesson in self-awareness on the biggest tennis podcast in America. You earn it by being exactly who you are, every single time.
I'm living my dream. This is what I dream to do. Become a professional tennis player, play against the best, be on the best courts, and they're full.
Let's go through every word of what happened, because this story has layers that the headlines aren't telling you. First, who is Andy Roddick, and why does his opinion carry the specific weight that it does? This is not a commentator who watched tennis from the stands. This is not a pundit who built a career on opinions about other people's matches. Andy Roddick is a former world #1. He won the 2003 US Open, the last American man to win a Grand Slam singles title. He contested 4 Wimbledon finals. He spent years battling Roger Federer at the absolute peak of the sport. He knows what elite looks like from the inside. He knows what pressure does to athletes. He knows the difference between a player who handles the spotlight and a player who is handled by it. And his podcast, Served with Andy Roddick, is not background noise. The episode featuring Alex Eala covered her breakthrough at Miami, her emergence as a national hero, her training with her grandfather, her move to the Rafa Nadal Academy at 13, her first interactions with Nadal himself, the Filipino fan base, and her philosophy of happiness through progress on court. 30 minutes, top to bottom, no softballs. And when the interview was over and Roddick and Wertheim were left alone with their reactions, the next 15 minutes of audio became the most quoted, most shared, most discussed segment in the podcast's history. Because what Roddick said in those 15 minutes was not what people expected from a former world #1 who had never met Alex Eala before sitting down to record.
It was a lesson in self-awareness. I'm sitting here at 43 years old, having been in this tennis game for a long time, and I'm going, there's no way I could ever be that pragmatic, that self-aware, especially in the eye of the popularity storm, and the responsibility that comes with that position, especially as she is the trailblazer from her country.
A 43-year-old former world #1, 43 years old, a man who has spent 20-plus years in professional sport, who competed at the very highest level this game offers, who has been interviewed himself thousands of times, who has conducted hundreds of interviews on his podcast, and he is saying, "I could not do what she is doing. Not at 20. Not in the eye of this storm. Not with the responsibility she is carrying. I could not be that pragmatic. I could not be that self-aware." Those are not words chosen carelessly. Pragmatic, self-aware. At 43, with everything he has lived, everything he has experienced, every evolution he has undergone as a human being since the end of his playing career, he is admitting that what Alex Eala demonstrates at 20 years old is beyond what he could have accessed at the same age. And that is the compliment that cuts through everything else. Not the rankings, not the wins over Swiatek, not the sold-out stadiums. The specific compliment of a world-class competitor saying, "I was not that together. I did not have that clarity. At 20, in the middle of my own rise, I did not possess what she possesses right now." But Roddick wasn't done. Because before the Miami interview even happened, back in January after Eala lost to Alicia Parks in the first round of the Australian Open, he had already been watching, already been taking notes, already been telling his audience something that the WTA should have been saying much louder and much sooner. He said on Served after the Australian Open, "You look at the views on her press conferences versus the top stars in the world. She has a massive, massive following in the Philippines. It's crazy impressive, and it's something that tournaments are going to have to pay attention to. Crazy impressive. And something tournaments are going to have to pay attention to." He wasn't just complimenting Eala, he was issuing a warning to every tournament director on the WTA calendar. A warning with the authority of a former world #1 and a man who understands the economics of professional sport. Pay attention. Not eventually. Not when it becomes impossible to ignore. Now. Because Eala's pre-tournament media session at the Australian Open pulled in 178,000 YouTube views, more than any other player at the event. That includes Carlos Alcaraz, Jannik Sinner, and Coco Gauff. Alcaraz, Sinner, Gauff. Three of the most recognizable names in professional tennis. Combined, they did not outperform the press conference view count of a 20-year-old Filipino girl who lost in the first round of the tournament. And Roddick, who had been watching these numbers, tracking this story, quietly building his interest all season, sat down with her in Miami and came away with something he didn't expect. He came away a bigger fan. A huge fan. Now let's talk about what Eala actually said in that interview. Because Roddick's reaction only makes sense when you hear the things that made him react the way he did.
In terms of who I am, from 2025 to 2026, it's just that my success kind of skyrocketed, which I'm very thankful for.
Nothing changed in terms of who she is. Not, "I've grown so much." Not, "I've become more confident, more professional, more polished." Who she is hasn't changed. The values, the groundedness, the philosophy, untouched. Only the success skyrocketed. And she is thankful for it. Not entitled to it. Not expectant of it. Thankful. As if it is a gift rather than the logical consequence of everything she has worked for since she was waking up at 4:45 in the morning in Quezon City as a 12-year-old.
It was coming. Like, the people were really coming. They were buying tickets. They were taking time out of their day, and it's wow. It's hard to. I think I was a little in denial. It's hard to accept.
In denial about her own phenomenon. The girl who has become the most talked about player on the WTA Tour, whose press conferences outperform Djokovic, whose crowds rival Alcaraz, whose social media numbers embarrass the world #1, was in denial about whether it was real. That is not performance. That is not curated humility designed for press conferences. That is a person who is genuinely trying to process something that has no precedent in the history of their sport. And then she said the sentence that made the Served podcast studio go completely quiet. For the first 10 years of my tennis career, I was training on a court that was half basketball. And now I've played on Wimbledon's center court, which is like my ultimate dream aside from winning Wimbledon. Half basketball. For 10 years. The greatest Filipino tennis player in history. The player whose press conferences outview Alcaraz, whose crowds make tournament directors call emergency press conferences, whose influence just prompted Andy Roddick to declare himself a huge fan. Spent the first decade of her tennis life on a court that was literally half basketball.
She's talking about playing on a tennis court that was half basketball court. Doesn't really fit the stereotype from like the early 80s where you're doing Aperol spritzes and, headbands and all. Like, these are winning stories.
And now she has stood on Wimbledon's center court. And her ultimate dream is to win Wimbledon. Not visit it, not play on it, win it. That one sentence, from a half basketball court in the Philippines to Wimbledon's center court, is the entire Alex Eala story compressed into a single breath. And when Roddick heard it, something clicked. Something that went beyond the podcast format, beyond the tennis statistics, beyond even his considerable experience as someone who has been in this game for decades. He said, "I think it's been a great story. I was fascinated before I talked to her. I'm a bigger fan after having spoken to her." Fascinated before. Bigger fan after. That is the arc of every person who has encountered Alex Eala in 2026. You hear the headlines. Wildcard beats Swiatek. Filipino girl sells out stadiums. Crowds that rival Alcaraz. And you are fascinated. You think you understand the story. You think you know what you're dealing with. And then you actually sit across from her. And you hear about the half basketball court. And the grandfather who saved the hard court every afternoon. And the DM she left Rafa Nadal on delivered for 4 days. And the press conferences she gives at 4 a.m. because her team is still awake even after 3-hour 20-minute matches. And the philosophy she carries onto every court. That if she masters the balance between confidence and humility, it's an amazing recipe. She said, "If I can master the times I need to be confident and the times I need to be humble and grateful, I think that's an amazing recipe. I'm able to compete and do my thing on the court, but I'm also aware of what I represent off it. Confident and humble and grateful simultaneously. Not alternating, simultaneously. That is the recipe." And Roddick, at 43, with a career behind him and a media platform in front of him, heard that recipe from a 20-year-old and said, "Lesson in self-awareness," because he knows how rare it is. He knows that most athletes, even the great ones, even the decorated ones, even the ones who win Grand Slams and reach world number 1, struggle to hold all three at the same time. Confident, humble, grateful. Pick 2. Most people can manage 2. Some days, even that's a stretch. Alex Eala is doing all 3. At 20. In the middle of the most overwhelming fame spike a young tennis player has experienced since Serena Williams first arrived. On a court that was half basketball 10 years ago. Now let's talk about what Roddick actually said about the WTA, because it was not gentle. He said tournaments are going to have to pay attention to Eala's following. It's crazy impressive. Going to have to, not should, not might want to. Have to. That is not a suggestion. That is a former world number 1 using the language of inevitability, the language of someone who looks at the data, at the 178,000 Australian Open press conference views, at the sold-out Dubai matches, at the Indian Wells crowds that rivaled Alcaraz and Sinner, at the Miami fans in the stands at midnight, and says, "This is not optional. This is not a trend to be monitored. This is a reality to be built around." And here is the brutal irony. The WTA, the organization designed to maximize the careers and opportunities of elite women's tennis players, had already been told this by its own numbers. By the Dubai 48% ticket sales surge, by the Australian Open crowd overflow, by the Djokovic press conference intervention, by James Blake's televised mea culpa about learning his lesson, by the WTA chair herself announcing structural reform in the same season that Eala has been delivering these numbers. And still, the scheduling decisions lag behind the reality. Still, the courts are sometimes too small. Still, the slots are sometimes too late. Still, the organization moves at the speed of bureaucracy, while Alex Eala moves at the speed of a nation's love. And now, Andy Roddick, the most credible independent voice in American tennis media, has sat across from her, heard 30 minutes of her truth, and added his voice to the chorus. Pay attention. This is crazy impressive. I was fascinated before, and I'm a huge fan now. When does the WTA start listening? When does the scheduling match the phenomenon? When does the organization stop reacting to Alex Eala and start planning for her? Producer Mike summed it up perfectly at the end of the episode, saying, "You're so mature. Are you actually like 47? 47. The joke landed because the truth behind it is so undeniable. A 20-year-old who carries herself like someone who has already lived an entire life in sport, who has already processed the gap between who she is and who the world sees her as, who has already found the recipe, confident, humble, grateful, that most athletes spend entire careers searching for and never quite locating. She found it on a half basketball court in the Philippines. She brought it to the Rafa Nadal Academy. She carried it through the ITF circuit. She walked it onto the court at the Miami Open as a wild card ranked 140th. She delivered it, point by point, match by match, tournament by tournament, until the numbers became impossible to ignore and Andy Roddick had to schedule the interview, and the former world number one sat across from her and felt like he was being taught something. I was fascinated before I talked to her. I'm a bigger fan after having spoken to her. Huge fan. The haters logged on this week expecting another narrative to push. They found Andy Roddick. They found a lesson in self-awareness. They found the confirmation from one of the most credible voices in the sport that what is happening around Alexandra Eala is not a moment. It is a movement. And it is only just beginning. Laban, Alex, even the world number ones are taking notes. If Andy Roddick's reaction gave you chills, smash that like button, subscribe, and ring that bell. Because the clay court season starts next month. And a girl who trained on a half basketball court is heading to Roland Garros. And absolutely nobody is ready.